Assemblyman Kiley, this is to you. 20 million Californians are fully vaccinated. That is 53% of our state's population. What would you do to get more people vaccinated, or do you believe personal choice, personal risk?
I believe in personal choice, and I should say that I have done everything as a member of the legislature to get information and access to my constituents. That is in stark contrast to Gavin Newsom. In October of last year, he cast doubt on the safety of the vaccine. He said we can't take the FDA's word for it. This drew a scathing rebuke from the chair of the United States Senate Health Committee, who said the governor needed to stop second-guessing the career scientists of the FDA. He said that Newsom was costing lives and discouraging Americans from taking the vaccine. And then when it came time to actually roll out the vaccine in December, California had the slowest rollout of any state. For a time, we were 50th out of 50 in actually administering our doses. I had asked Newsom to call a special session of the legislature so we could be there to help, but he refused. He said he was going to do it on his own, and he blew it. You had seniors who were told they were eligible, would spend all day on the phone trying to get an appointment and couldn't get one. And this was at the time when it mattered most, when COVID was at its peak, when hospitalizations were at their peak, when deaths were at their peak. We undoubtedly could have saved lives if we had had a better government performance. We certainly would have done a lot more good than the hoopla with these vaccine lotteries and these steps we're taking towards mandates and passports. It is a perfect case study for the perversity of California politics, using bright lights and cash giveaways and state control as a mirage for a broken state government that fails to serve California in the most basic ways.
Here in our state, there are parents today outside of this library in the parking lot who've lost children to fentanyl, and they're protesting and asking for relief from Sacramento. If elected governor, what would you do to stop this avalanche of drugs and stop the cartels from coming into our states? Thank you.
Well, thank you. It's a very important question, and I was just at an event for parents in my own district whose son tragically died of fentanyl late last year, who would have been a senior, would have just graduated from Whitney High School in Rockland. And this is an issue that is affecting more and more families throughout the state. So public awareness is a very big part of it. Obviously, a lot of the issues at the border exist on the federal level, but there are things that we can do at the state level as well. For example, laws like the sanctuary state absolutely need to be rolled back, which have gotten in the way of our law enforcement in order to keep folks who are dangerous to our communities out and to actually enforce the law and keep our community safe. I'll also note that California has made changes to our drug laws that have been entirely counterproductive. I was a prosecutor before I ran for office. I was a deputy attorney general for the state, and I saw right before I ran in 2016 that recent changes to our criminal law were having a devastating impact on the safety of our communities. It's taken Gavin Newsom 5 years now with a pending recall to finally realize there is a problem and say that he's tough on crime. Prop 47, to take one example, has made it so you can't charge someone with a felony for even using Class A drugs. That's why we have open drug use on our streets. It's also why prosecutors no longer have the leverage to actually force offenders into drug treatment, so they're not given the tools they need in order to turn their lives around. It's a lose-lose. It hurts public safety and it hurts the offenders themselves, and we make far too many of those lose-lose choices in California. Well, the governor will make a decision if this bill passes the legislature on whether to sign or veto a bill to mandate the teaching of CRT, or as it's being called, ethnic studies, in every single high school as a graduation requirement, and I would certainly veto that bill. I spoke against it on the floor of the Assembly. But what's important to note is that just 2 years ago, Gavin Newsom was against this too. When the first edition of this curriculum came out, it was universally condemned. Newsom himself said it was offensive in so many ways, and it would never see the light of day. The California Legislative Jewish Caucus wrote a letter saying that the curriculum echoed the propaganda of the Nazi regime. We should have scrapped the whole thing then, but instead they made a few edits and are now seeking to impose it on every high school student in California. But I think the important point of CRT is that it's exposed a vacuum in our public education system. We don't truly teach civics in our schools anymore, at least not like we used to. Civics used to not just be some add-on to the curriculum, but it was the unifying thread of your education to empower you to prepare for citizenship, to be a productive member of society, to learn about the things that make America great and our founding principles. But we don't teach education. We don't think about education that way anymore. And so CRT has come along and is exploding that vacuum. If we're no longer going to teach our kids how to build their communities up, then we'll teach them how to tear their communities down. So I think we need to defeat this CRT bill, but we ultimately need to reimpose a sort of a real civic education in our schools.
Thank you, Assemblyman. Before we begin round two, I remind the audience that has joined us either on the radio or television since the beginning of the debate that your ballot will arrive next week. There are 2 questions, yes or no, should Gavin Newsom remain in office? And then if he is removed from office, who should replace him? Would it be one of these 4 people?
Cannot be done unilaterally by the governor. It requires a changing of the laws. I know when you were on the issue, you said you wanted to call a special session of the legislature, bring them all back and deal with issues like homelessness. What specifically would you want to see in terms of the budget? And if the legislature say, no, we're not going to work with you, what do you do?
Well, it's the governor himself who has gotten in the way of a lot of cases. And I should say at the outset that, homelessness in California is a human tragedy and a national disgrace. We have more wealth in this state than all but 5 countries, and yet we have thousands of people dying on our streets. So I decided to do an audit of all the homelessness spending in California, because we keep spending more and more, and the problem keeps getting worse and worse. We have 9 times the unsheltered homeless population as the next closest state. My audit would have looked at where all the spending is going and why isn't it solving the problem. It got unanimous support on the Senate side of the audit committee, but the governor's administration testified against it, and we fell a single vote short on the assembly side. And so what's happened? We've simply continued spending more money, and the problems only continue to get worse. The nonpartisan legislative analyst said more spending will quickly dissipate because there is no strategy. The governor's own mental health czar, his top mental health advisor, said in an interview in March that homelessness in California is not a money problem, it's a leadership problem. So what would I do? I would bring a new strategy, and I would bring new leadership. Under the Ninth Circuit decision, you can't ask people to move along and get off the streets if there's a place for them to go. So I'd make sure there's a shelter, there's a roof over their head, there's a place for them to go. But then I'd connect them with the needed services, substance abuse treatment, mental health counseling, job training, you name it. This isn't brain surgery. We can look at what's worked in other states, and we can do it here.
All right, thank you
very
very much.
Kiley, we've got a legislature that hasn't done some of these basic things that the congressman just outlined. How do we get the legislature to work with you as governor to make California more attractive, A, for businesses to move into California, and B, to keep them from leaving?
Well, I'll say, first of all, that a lot of the damage isn't actually done by the legislature. The legislature has delegated an enormous amount of power to California state agencies, and that's where a lot of the damage is done. They churn out regulation after regulation and entangle themselves more and more in our lives every year. And so as governor, you could bring new leadership. You could give all of these state agencies, CARB, the Water Board, the EDD, the Department of Public Health, a new directive to actually serve the people of California. Don't harass them or harangue them or try to run their lives like a lot of them do. But ultimately, in order to have sweeping change, and so yes, I would try to roll back those regulations and would do so using executive authority. But to have more sweeping change, you need to get the legislature to act. And the thing about the problem that you've cited is you hear a lot of these examples about Elon Musk and HP and the big companies, but actually the arrangement works out pretty well for big companies who have wide margins in a lot of cases, who have compliance departments who can tell them how to follow the law, who have lawyers on staff who can help them reduce litigation risks. It's small businesses who ultimately pay the price, and we saw that more than ever during the COVID shutdown, as powerful industries like Hollywood were exempted from the lockdowns while small businesses die in droves. So I would immediately work on things like rolling back PAGA, which is a huge impediment, is a huge litigation risk for businesses, certainly repealing AB 5, and doing a systematic review of every regulation that needlessly makes it so difficult to do business in California.
Assemblyman Kiley, does the rest of the state even understand the agricultural devastation brought about either on the North Coast or in the Central Valley by water cutoffs?
Well, a lot of folks probably don't, see the immediate impact of it, but certainly will experience the ultimate impact of it because we rely on our farmers for our food supply. And so we absolutely cannot have them be the first to have to face rationing and cutbacks whenever we hit these dry spells. So, to answer your immediate question, yes, I would seek to roll that back in any way I could and to put our farmers as our first priority rather than always being our last priority. But yes, the long-term solution ultimately is to recognize that this is a political choice we have made. The governor's own agriculture secretary said that the reason for these cutbacks was Mother Nature and climate change. That is not true. The reason we're facing these cutbacks is because of political choices that we have made. Rationing and cutbacks and scarcity, those are political choices when we know full well that endemic to our climate are periods of wetness and dryness. We used to do things differently. We built the State Water Project back in the 1960s. The world hasn't seen anything like it. It was a marvel of engineering, but then we rested on our laurels, and we haven't expanded capacity in any significant way since. So I actually am authoring an Assembly constitutional amendment that will dedicate a fixed portion of the general fund every year to water storage projects. Temperance Flat, Sites Reservoir, there's a low-hanging fruit like raising the water level at San Luis and Shafta. We can have an affordable supply of water and one that is sustainable, and we can embrace abundance rather than scarcity.
Thank you so much, Hugh. And this is the California recall debate. This is not a Republican primary debate, even though we've got a bunch of Republicans on the stage. And if you look at polls right now, about 40 to 50% of California voters are undecided on who to pick on question number 2 on the ballot, which is who should replace Governor Newsom. We know Democrats can vote on that question, even if they vote to try to keep Governor Newsom. We know there's a lot of Democrats that are in favor of the recall, and so they're trying to figure out where do they go. There is not an establishment Democrat on the ballot. And so I want to ask some questions that are important to Democrats to get your take on them. And Assemblyman Kiley, let's start with you. If Senator Feinstein were to retire next year, you would be in charge of appointing her replacement. If you picked a Republican, the Republicans would get control of the United States Senate. There are a lot of Democrats who would say, she's a Democrat, Senator Padilla is a Democrat, they both won overwhelmingly, Joe Biden won this state by 30 points, she should be replaced by a Democrat. Isn't that the most fair thing, and can you commit that you would appoint a Democrat to that seat?
Well, actually, Alex, I hate to do this, but I have to reject the premise of your question. I wouldn't make an appointment at all. I would leave it up to the voters, which is exactly what I, asked Gavin Newsom to do when there was the vacancy in Kamala Harris's seat. He didn't do so. He appointed Alex Padilla, who had a very fraught history in his tenure as Secretary of State. And so the voters of California were deprived of choosing their state senator, one of the most important offices in the entire country. As a matter of fact, what the governor did was of questionable legality. I actually got a legal opinion from our legislative counsel's office saying that no, Gavin Newsom's appointee cannot be, or Gavin Newsom cannot serve the remainder of Kamala Harris's term. Before the term expires, there needs to be an elected senator. And so now it's almost like farce. There's a bill that's going through the state legislature, and what it's doing is you're going to have 2 elections for the same office on your ballot next year for a United States senator. There's going to be one election for who's going to serve the next 6-year term, and then there's another election for who's going to serve like the last month of the existing term. So this is all too typical of what happens in our state capitol, is we try to shut voters out in every way possible. And so here they solve the constitutional problem in the least democratic way imaginable. That's what ultimately this recall is about, is returning power to the people of California.
This is to you. Linda Merkins is a voter who asks, how do you preserve single-family neighborhoods but still increase housing opportunities?
Well, it's a great question, because housing is maybe the core issue as to why the American dream is falling apart in California. There was a recent survey that showed that 2/3 of Californians believe that kids growing up in our state today will be worse off than their parents. And it's why more and more people are packing up U-Hauls in order to avoid that fate. Last year, for the first time in California's 170-year history, our population declined. It's truly staggering. You know, this used to be the state where anyone could get ahead. Now it's the state that many can't wait to leave behind. And our soaring housing costs are central to that. Gavin Newsom promised a Marshall Plan on housing, but he has not produced anything of the sort. You know, construction has actually declined, and he's provided about 1/5 of the units that he promised. All the while, we now have a median house price in California that's over $750,000. That's up 20% just in the last year. And so you can get a good job after college, work hard, do everything right, and you not be able to form a down payment on your home until you're in your 40s. So it's very important to preserve single-family neighborhoods and to allow for local flexibility and local autonomy. But there are simple steps that we could take to increase the supply of housing. We could certainly streamline the permitting process. We could eliminate all of the fees and costs that can be on average $150,000. We can reform CEQA and other litigation traps and do what other states do, where they get projects right off the ground.
One of the things that the governor in Florida has done is he said that state universities in Florida cannot contract and cannot enter into agreements across a whole wide variety of areas with China, with Russia, with Cuba, with Venezuela, with Syria, with Iran. Is that something you'd support here for the UC system and for the CSU system as well?
Well, it sounds like something certainly worth looking at. With the UC, it's a little complicated because they're constitutionally independent. The state can't regulate them in the same way that they can the CSUs. But the problem that you bring up is one that I have a great deal of familiarity with. When I was in private practice, I prosecuted the civil case against Huawei Technologies for intellectual property theft. And this is in the public documents in the case. They had stolen this this smartphone testing robot from the lab of our client, and then, basically tried to steal the IP. And the Wall Street Journal, in a front-page article a couple years ago, cited our case as the basis for the federal action that followed against Huawei technology. And so it is a very serious issue, and we need aggressive action of this on the federal level as well as where appropriate at the state level. I'll also add, by the way, that the threats to intellectual property in California don't just come from China. They come from our state legislature as well. I'm on the Judiciary Committee, and I see bills every year that erode intellectual property protections because they're trial lawyer-backed bills that seek to create new ways to sue people. This is just one of the many reasons that California is routinely rated the top judicial hellhole in the United States. But on the issue of universities, at the end of the day, I think what we need at our universities is to have a culture of free and open debate instead of them being sort of the sites of censorship that they've become. My first piece of legislation was a resolution to protect freedom of speech at our colleges and universities. It passed the legislature unanimously, but we've only seen backsliding since.
Ambassador, I have 2 questions left, so I'll ask two of you each. The first one, I'll ask Assemblyman Kiley to go on. The mask mandate for elementary school children. School begins in 30 days. The Orange County Board of Education sued Governor Newsom to stop any sort of mask mandate in the Orange County Public Schools. What do you believe you could do to stop mask mandates on elementary school kids if you were elected governor in a month?
Well, I'm 100% against a mask mandate at the state level. California is one of only a handful of states that has one, and I think that a lot of the authority to impose that stems from the state of emergency. So I would terminate the state of emergency on day one. Parents know what is best for their kids. They should be making these decisions for themselves. But I'll say as a broader point that California, as I mentioned, is one of only a handful of states that still has this policy. And we've been a national outlier throughout the COVID era. Of all the 50 states, we had the harshest lockdowns. Of all the 50 states, we had the longest school closures. We were the last to open just about everything. And so to make the case that California got it right, you also have to make the case that all 49 other states got it wrong. And that's a case that simply cannot be made on the basis of the data. When you look at education, our kids have fared worse here than anywhere. We've done more harm to them, including lowering their life expectancy, according to the Journal of the American Medical Association. Our unemployment rate has been the second highest in the country throughout the COVID era, and our public health outcomes have actually been among the worst as well when you measure excess mortality. If our excess mortality rate were even on par with the national average, thousands more Californians would be alive today. So I think that the lessons that we need to draw from this, which this governor clearly has not drawn, is that states that took a different approach, that followed the science, that took a balanced approach, and that trusted their citizens did a lot better, and I would learn from them and have that model here in California as governor.
As governor, you would have the ability to appoint judges, which are so important to policy in this state. What is your judicial philosophy, and what does a judge look like that you're appointing?
Well, I appoint judges that would uphold the Constitution and would set the parameters for our politics, that would not seek to, participate in our politics. I've gotten a little experience in the courts this last year plus when Assemblymember James Gallagher and I took Governor Newsom to court for abusing his emergency powers. We had seen very early, in the very early stages of COVID-19, that he was using executive powers, emergency powers, in a way that our Constitution does not envision, to actually make policy, to usurp the role of the legislative branch. So we took him to court in June of last year. We represented ourselves, actually, as attorneys, and we won a trial in Sutter County last November, and we're now seeking review by the California Supreme Court in order to uphold a very important principle, which is that we have a separation of powers, we have the rule of law, we have the Constitution, we have checks and balances, and even in an emergency, especially in an emergency, we need to have a representative government. And so we're hoping to get a ruling for the California Supreme Court that will be a very important precedent, that we will never have one-man rule in California again, and I will certainly look to appoint justices, whether at the Supreme Court level or throughout our judiciary, who will be of that mind.
Ambassador Kiley, what's your favorite restaurant in California?
Did I get promoted?
Oh, sorry. I'm sorry. Assemblyman Kiley. Who knows?
Maybe one day, maybe one day.
At some point. Yeah.
I would go with Frank Fat's. It's close to the Capitol, but there's actually 2 offshoots of it in my district. Unbelievably good Chinese food.
You didn't say French Laundry.
Never been. Apparently, I'm one of the few politicians in California who hasn't.